Hello and welcome. I'm Rawia Alami and this is the Dailies, where we take a look at important news stories, reports, analyses and articles published in newspapers and media outlets across the world. Most newspapers focus today on President Trump's pledge to impose 50% tariffs against Brazil for what he described as a witch hunt against his political ally, former President Jair Bolsonaro, who's facing trial for attempting a coup. Another news story attracted a lot of attention today as well was Trump and Congress moving closer to Ukraine as the White House prepares to send additional weaponry to the war-torn country, and Congress moving to enact tough new sanctions on Russia. And of course, the Middle East continued to be the focus of many news outlets today as the Gaza ceasefire negotiations continue with no breakthroughs reported. Let's start with the New York Times, which reported today on President Trump's announcement of a 50% tariffs on all Brazilian imports. The report details the sudden escalation in U.S.-Brazil relations after President Trump cited what he calls a witch hunt against his ally, former President Jair Bolsonaro. The piece explains that Trump's move, framed as retaliation for Bolsonaro's prosecution over coup attempts, was swiftly met by Brazilian President Lula da Silva's vow to reciprocate, deepening fears of a trade war between the two economic giants. The report also highlights Trump's use of tariffs as leverage, not just for trade, but to intervene in Brazil's judicial affairs, an unprecedented tactic with significant economic and diplomatic risks. Lula rebuffed Trump's demands, defending Brazil's judicial independence and dismissing the U.S. president's accusations as inaccurate and offensive. We'll stay with the New York Times, which expanded on this major story of President Trump's reigniting trade wars, asking whether the president is truly making America more competitive, as he claims. The report also highlights that economists and industry experts warn that these sweeping trade restrictions could actually harm U.S. competitiveness by raising costs for manufacturers and stifling innovation. The piece underscores concerns over Trump's rollback of clean energy subsidies and cuts to scientific research, suggesting these moves may leave American industries trailing global rivals, especially China. Experts also point out to immigration crackdowns and reduced public R&D as threats to the nation's historic leadership in technology and talent. The piece also includes this graph, which also concludes that recent polls show growing public disapproval of Trump's economic approach, particularly among young voters, as worries about inflation and stagnation rise. To the Financial Times now, where Alan Beatty wrote saying President Trump's tariff shambles is a helpful warning to the world. The article critiques President Trump's chaotic approach to tariffs, highlighting how his shifting deadlines and threats, such as the delayed reciprocal tariffs, have created confusion rather than results. The author argues that Trump's poorly executed trade policies serve as a cautionary tale for other governments, demonstrating the economic damage and lack of coherent strategy involved. While some countries have adopted targeted protectionist measures, none are following Trump's broad tariff path. The author also points out that instead his actions have increased support for international cooperation, much like Brexit's aftermath strengthened the EU. The piece concludes that despite Trump's bluster, his tariff campaign is widely seen as a failure, reinforcing the global consensus that sustained protectionism harms rather than helps national economies. As the Washington Post reported on the White House's preparedness to send additional weaponry to Ukraine and Congress moving to enact tough new sanctions on Russia, Mark Thiessen wrote in the newspaper stressing his confidence that the president will keep his word and side with Kiev, emphasizing Trump's reputation for following through on bold promises. The article also recounts Trump's record of decisive action on border security, Iran, ISIS and Syria. And he also argues that with Putin rejecting peace, also Trump will now deliver on his pledge to support Ukraine. The author expects Trump to impose severe secondary tariffs on Russian oil and dramatically increase U.S. weapons supplies to Kiev, shifting from defensive to more robust offensive support. The piece advocates a maximum pressure strategy, crippling Russia's economy and arming Ukraine not just through aid, but also via arms sales and frozen Russian assets. The author concludes that Trump's assertive stance aims to force Putin to negotiate, ensuring U.S. credibility and Ukraine's long-term security. In its editorial, the Jerusalem Post argues that Israel must end the Gaza war promptly or risk losing critical support from moderate Arab states for broader regional peace. Saudi and Syrian voices at a rare Knesset conference warned that Gaza remains the main obstacle to expanding the Abraham Accords and normalizing ties with countries like Saudi Arabia. The article stresses that Israel's current military advantage gives it unique leverage, but power must be used to secure peace, not just manage conflict. The proposed Abraham Shield plan envisions a demilitarized Gaza under technocratic, Arab-backed administration, balancing Palestinian dignity with Israeli security. The editorial concludes that if Israel fails to present a credible post-war vision, it may forfeit its chance to build a lasting alliance against Iran and achieve transformative regional integration. Owen Jones wrote an article in The Guardian titled, "This column does not express support for Palestine action, and here is why." Jones critiques Britain's increasingly restrictive approach to protest, focusing on the government's decision to proscribe Palestine Action as a terrorist organization. He also argues that the new legal framework criminalizes even non-violent protests, with citizens facing up to 14 years in prison for expressing support. The author contrasts the treatment of Palestine Action, whose actions included throwing paint at military planes, with historic suffragette militancy now celebrated by officials. Suffrage, by the way, is a term used to refer to women activists fighting for voting rights. Now, the piece highlights recent arrests, including that of an 83-year-old priest, as evidence of the law's overreach. Jones contends that equating civil disobedience with terrorism erodes democratic norms, warning that such measures intended to suppress dissent over Britain's role in Gaza signal a dangerous slide towards authoritarianism. Following French President's state visit to the UK, Alistair Heath wrote in The Telegraph, offering a scathing critique of the visit, framing it as symbolic of the decline of both nations. The author laments how Britain and France, once global leaders, are now converging in economic stagnation, high taxes, and also ineffective governance and social discontent. The review accuses both leaders of adopting each other's worst policies, from burdensome regulation to misguided immigration and education reforms, and highlights mounting public debt, weakened military, and eroding social cohesion. The article also criticizes the UK's perceived deference to France on immigration and other issues, arguing that both governments are complicit in their country's decline. Ultimately, it portrays the Franco-British relationship as a tragic partnership, with both nations locked in a race to the bottom. As American newspapers continue to focus on the aftermath of the Texas flash floods, the Wall Street Journal published an analytical report asking why America still can't get disaster alerts right. The report examines the persistent failures of America's emergency alert systems, highlighting how alerts sent via phones, radio, TV, and sirens often fail to reach those most at risk due to technical gaps, lack of cell service, or alert fatigue, where excessive notifications prompt users to disable warnings altogether. The piece goes on to say that rural areas face additional challenges, with officials sometimes lacking resources or authority to issue timely alerts. Human error and system mishaps, such as misdirected or delayed warnings, further erode public trust. The report concludes that despite technological advances, America's fragmented alert infrastructure remains a step behind, leaving communities dangerously vulnerable in a fast-moving disaster. And we'll end with this insight brief by Foreign Policy Analytics, produced with the support from the Population Institute, where American news publication and magazine explores the implication of demographic trends, the risks of reactionary policies aimed at reversing fertility declines, and the urgent need to center reproductive rights and autonomy in a population policy debates. The study indeed notes that the world's population is expected to peak at 10.3 billion in the next 50 years before declining. Fertility rates are dropping due to better education, urbanization, and greater opportunities for women. But this trend varies. Sub-Saharan Africa will keep growing, while East Asia and Europe face shrinking populations. The brief warns that some governments are responding with restrictive pro-natalist policies that threaten reproductive rights and fuel anti-immigrant sentiment. Meanwhile, millions, especially in low and middle income countries, still lack access to contraception and reproductive health care. The brief urges investment in education, health, and gender equality to ensure people everywhere can make informed, voluntary choices about their reproductive futures. That's it for today. Thanks for watching.